The temperature outside is 45 degrees below zero, not the wind chill. The actual air temperature, that is 45 degrees below the point at which water freezes. It is cold enough that exposed skin begins to sustain damage within minutes. It is cold enough that diesel fuel, without chemical treatment, begins to turn into something closer to gel than liquid. It is cold enough that the metal of the truck itself contracts, that seals shrink, that lubricants thicken, and that the chemistry inside a battery slows to a fraction of what it was designed to do. And somewhere on a 200-mile stretch of gravel and packed snow, on the most remote commercial highway in North America, a driver reaches for the ignition, turns the key, and hears nothing. Not a slow crank, not a reluctant groan. Nothing. The silence that follows that moment is unlike any other silence a truck driver encounters, because it means the most fundamental system on the entire rig. The electrical heart that starts the engine, runs the bunk heater, powers the electronics, and keeps the ECM alive, has failed, and it has failed here, in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, in a place where there is no roadside assistance, no cell signal, no shelter, and no guarantee that another vehicle will pass in the next hour. This is not a hypothetical. This happens on Alaska's Dalton Highway, known to the drivers who run it as the Haul Road, every winter. And what happens next, and why it happens, and how experienced Arctic truckers prevent it, reveals an entire layer of professional knowledge that most people never think about when they watch a truck roll past on a highway. If you're watching this on your television, thank you for being part of this channel. If you haven't subscribed yet, doing so helps this series reach more people, and sharing it with someone who'd find it fascinating matters more than you might think. Now, let's get into it. The Dalton Highway stretches 414 miles from the outskirts of Fairbanks north to Deadhorse, the service community at Prudhoe Bay on the Arctic Ocean. It is Alaska Route 11. It was built in 1974 to support construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, and it remains the lifeline for the oil fields and remote communities of Alaska's North Slope. Carriers like Carlisle Transportation, Linden Transport, Alaska West Express, and 49th Freight run this road year-round, delivering everything from food and fuel to heavy drilling equipment and industrial machinery. In winter, the temperature at Atigun Pass, the highest road crossing in Alaska at 4,739 feet in the Brooks Range near mile 244, can drop below -50 Fahrenheit. On the coastal plain north of the Brooks Range, the combination of extreme cold and constant Arctic wind can push conditions into territory that is genuinely dangerous for humans and machines alike. Every truck making this run is, by necessity, a self-contained survival system. But within that system, there is one component whose failure creates a cascading crisis unlike almost any other. Not the engine, not the transmission, not even the bunk heater, though that failure is terrifying in its own right. The single most consequential cold weather failure, the one that strands trucks in the dark and can transform a manageable breakdown into a life-threatening situation, is the battery bank. To understand why, you need to understand something that most people only vaguely know about batteries. They are, at their core, a chemical system. A lead-acid battery produces electricity through an electrochemical reaction between lead plates and a sulfuric acid electrolyte solution. At room temperature, that chemistry works efficiently. But temperature governs the rate of every chemical reaction, and as the temperature drops, the reaction slows. At 32 degrees Fahrenheit, a fully charged lead-acid battery already loses around 20 to 30% of its rated capacity. At 0 degrees Fahrenheit, that loss reaches roughly 50%. And at the temperatures found on the Dalton Highway in deep winter, -40, -45, -50, a battery that is not perfectly maintained and fully charged may retain only a third or less of the energy it was designed to deliver. This matters enormously for a commercial truck, because the electrical demands of a diesel semi are not small. A Class 8 tractor doesn't run on a single battery. It runs on a battery bank, typically 4 batteries, each rated at 900 to 1,150 cold cranking amps, wired in combination to deliver somewhere between 2,500 and 4,000 cca to the starter. Cold cranking amps is a specific measurement. It represents the current a battery can supply at 0 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 seconds while maintaining at least 7.2 volts. It is the industry's standard measure of starting power in cold conditions, and it is defined at 0 degrees, not at -45, where conditions on the Dalton can actually be found. Here is the problem that experienced haul road drivers understand, and most outside observers don't. The battery bank is engineered to provide sufficient power under normal cold conditions. But the diesel engine it needs to start also becomes dramatically harder to crank in extreme cold. Engine oil that flows easily at operating temperature becomes thick and resistant in the deep cold. A 15W40 conventional oil, which is perfectly appropriate for many fleet operations, becomes increasingly difficult to pump at temperatures below -4 Fahrenheit. Many Arctic-focused fleets switch to 5W40 or Duro W40 full synthetic oil specifically because the lower winter weight rating means the oil flows more readily through a cold engine. Even so, the starter motor turning over a large displacement diesel at -45 is working against significantly higher internal resistance than it was designed to expect. The engine needs more energy to start precisely when the batteries that supply that energy are delivering the least. The engineers who designed these trucks understood the problem. The batteries are sized with margin, but margin is not infinite, and it degrades over time in ways that are not always obvious to the driver. Battery age is the factor that surprises people most. A brand new battery bank has its full rated capacity after 2 or 3 years of hard use, in a truck running through temperature swings from warm terminals in Fairbanks to extreme cold on the North Slope, vibrating over rough gravel road, cycling through deep discharge and recharge. The battery bank's effective capacity has declined significantly. A battery at 70% of its original health, operating at -45 degrees in an environment where it may only deliver half its rated output, is left with perhaps 35% of the capacity it had when it was new. Against the starting demands of a cold diesel engine, that margin can disappear entirely. What makes the Dalton specifically dangerous is the stretch that drivers call the gap between Coldfoot and Dead Horse. Coldfoot Camp sits at mile 175, and it is the last significant service point before Dead Horse at mile 414. Between those 2 points, there are no service stations, no repair facilities, no hotels, no warming shelters, and for most of the route, no cell phone coverage. A driver who loses electrical power in this corridor cannot call for help through conventional means. The CB radio may still work if the problem is isolated to the start circuit rather than the battery bank itself. But CB range is limited, and there may be no other driver within radio range for extended periods. This is not a situation that resolves itself. At -45, a truck that cannot start its engine is losing heat from the sleeper cab from the moment the auxiliary power unit runs down or fails to start. At those temperatures, an unheated cab cools toward ambient temperature faster than most people imagine. Without the engine running and without a functional heating system, a driver in a static truck is facing a survival situation within hours. The cargo in the trailer, whether food, fuel, or industrial supplies, is also at risk. And the truck itself faces secondary damage as lubricants and fluids in cold, unheated systems congest and thicken in ways that compound the original problem. Here is what experienced haul road drivers know about battery failure that never makes it into a trucking manual. The warning signs come hours before the failure. They come in the morning, at the coldest point of the day, when the driver attempts to start the engine after a rest stop. A battery bank in genuine health cranks the engine with a certain authority. The starter spins the motor at a consistent speed. The engine catches quickly because the fuel injection system and glow plugs received full voltage during the start sequence. A battery bank in decline cranks more slowly. The engine takes longer to catch. On the coldest mornings, experienced drivers hear this and know it. They file the information away. They think about where they are and where the next service point is. They think about whether to continue or whether to turn around while the road is still in their favor. But a driver who has not learned to read these signals, and there are drivers every year making their first or second winter run on the Dalton, may dismiss a slow crank as normal for the cold weather. It can feel like normal. Cold engines are always slower to start. The distinction between a cold engine starting reluctantly and a battery bank that is genuinely failing requires experience to recognize. And that distinction, in some stretches of the haul road, is the difference between reaching cold foot and not reaching anywhere. The actual moment of complete battery failure at those temperatures is distinct from what most drivers experience in milder climates. In moderate cold, a failing battery often gives a series of warning cranks, slower each time, weaker each attempt, until eventually the starter barely turns. At -45, the degradation can be more abrupt. A battery bank that is marginally functional may successfully start the engine in the morning. But if the truck is stopped again, for a fuel check, for a wait station, for a roadside inspection, or because something in the road ahead required a halt, and the engine is shut down for even a short period, the battery bank may cool enough during that interval to lose the remaining margin it held. The second attempt to start may produce nothing. Not a slow crank. Nothing at all. When that happens, the driver's options are defined entirely by what they prepared for before leaving Fairbanks. The most fundamental preparation is the health of the battery bank itself. Serious cold weather trucking operations don't wait for batteries to fail. They replace battery banks on a scheduled cycle, typically every 2 to 3 years for vehicles operating in sustained Arctic conditions, without waiting for a battery to show obvious decline. This sounds expensive, and it is, but a mid-Dalton breakdown requires a tow truck response that, in practice, means hours of waiting and recovery costs that dwarf the cost of a proactive battery replacement. Fleets operating on the haul road understand this calculus. Owner-operators who ignore it tend to learn it once. Beyond scheduled replacement, there is the matter of how the batteries are maintained through the winter. At truck stops with shore power, including cold foot, which provides electrical hookups for drivers resting overnight, a truck plugged into a 110-volt outlet can run its block heater, which is an electric heating element installed in the engine cooling system. The block heater warms the coolant and, indirectly, the engine oil and the engine block itself. This accomplishes two things simultaneously. It means that when the driver starts the engine in the morning, the internal resistance is far lower. The oil flows easily, the coolant circulates freely, and the battery bank doesn't need to supply the enormous current surge that a full cold start requires. A warm engine starts on a fraction of the electrical energy that a cold engine demands. This is the block heater's primary operational value in extreme cold. It transfers the thermal burden from the battery to the shore power grid, protecting the battery bank's state of charge and extending its life. What many non-truckers don't realize is that the block heater is only one piece of this system. Serious Arctic operators also use battery blankets, insulated wraps fitted around the battery boxes, sometimes with a heating element powered by shore power, that prevent the battery bank's temperature from dropping as far as the ambient air. A battery that spent the night at -20 rather than -45 will deliver dramatically more starting power in the morning. The physics is unambiguous. Maintaining battery temperature is not a luxury in Arctic operations. It is a fundamental survival strategy. When shore power isn't available, in a rest spot north of Adigun Pass, or on the flat coastal plain near the northern end of the highway, the driver is relying on the truck's own heat retention and whatever preparation they carried with them. Some drivers run the engine through the night, or set a timer on the APU, the auxiliary power unit, to cycle the engine at regular intervals and prevent the battery bank from cooling too far. This approach consumes fuel, but maintains the electrical system's operating temperature. It is a calculated trade. Diesel fuel against battery health and starting reliability. The APU itself, which powers the sleeper cab's heating and electrical systems independently of the main engine, has its own battery dependency. Most diesel APUs use a small ignition battery separate from the main truck battery bank. But in extreme cold, the APU's fuel system and the glow pin in its combustion chamber face the same cold weather vulnerabilities as any diesel system. An APU that has not been properly maintained, or whose glow pin has accumulated carbon deposits from infrequent use, may fail to start in the conditions that make it most necessary. The sequence of failures that can result: battery bank weakens. APU fails to start because its own ignition system is compromised. Main engine cannot start because the battery bank has no remaining capacity. Is a cascading electrical crisis that very few drivers outside of Arctic operations have ever thought through. This is the part that experienced haul road veterans describe as the lesson you only want to learn from someone else. Because every step in that cascade was preventable, APU manufacturers like ESPAR recommend running the unit for 15 to 30 minutes monthly throughout the year, including summer, specifically to cycle the glow pin and prevent carbon buildup. Main battery banks should be tested professionally before winter, not just loaded on the truck and hoped for. Battery boxes should be insulated or heated. Engine oil should be switched to a low-viscosity synthetic like 5W40 or 0W40 before the temperature drops. Fuel should be treated with anti-gel additives, and drivers running the Dalton in deep winter typically use Arctic-grade diesel that the fueling points supply in winter months. All of these steps compound. Each one reduces the probability of a single failure. Combined, they create the margin that keeps a truck running in conditions that would end a poorly prepared vehicle in the first cold night. But suppose a driver finds themselves with a dead battery bank regardless. Suppose the preparation was incomplete, or the battery simply reached the end of its life on this run rather than the previous one, or the night was colder than the forecast projected. What then? The first tool in the driver's response, if another truck is within reach, is a jump start. But jump starting a commercial truck is not the same process as jump starting a car. A Class 8 diesel requires thousands of cold cranking amps from the booster source. Standard consumer jump packs rated for cars are not adequate. The booster vehicle ideally needs to be another Class 8 truck, connected with heavy gauge jumper cables. The truck news guide specifies cables at least 15 to 20 feet long with a minimum 2-gauge thickness, and allowed to run for several minutes to push charge into the depleted bank before attempting a start. Even then, at -45, the transfer of charge is slow because cold batteries accept charge inefficiently. The chemistry that is too sluggish to deliver current is also too sluggish to receive it quickly. A jump start that would take 3 minutes in a parking lot in Fairbanks may take 20 minutes or more on the side of the Dalton in deep winter. And those 20 minutes, standing outside in -45 air, managing cables and connections with thick gloves, watching for other traffic on a narrow gravel highway, are not 20 comfortable minutes. Drivers who run the haul road regularly know the importance of CB radio in these situations. The CB, channel 19 for most highway communication, though specific channels vary by corridor, is the primary communication tool in a region where cell service does not exist. A driver with a dead battery and a working CB can reach other trucks. A driver whose entire electrical system has failed, battery bank completely flat, no reserve at all, may not even have radio capability, depending on their setup. This is why some experienced Arctic truckers carry a small, independent emergency radio or satellite communicator. Devices like the Garmin InReach allow two-way text messaging via satellite regardless of cell infrastructure, and a driver with one of these on the Dalton can signal their carrier, request assistance, and maintain contact while waiting for help. Without any communication capability, the driver's options narrow to waiting for another truck to pass and flagging it down, a process that, in low traffic periods on the northern Dalton, could involve a wait of several hours. The question of how long a driver can safely wait in a static truck at these temperatures depends entirely on what they brought with them. A truck with a dead engine and no heating system is losing heat from the moment the engine stops. At -45, the interior of a sleeper cab will cool toward ambient temperature. The rate depends on insulation quality, whether there are any auxiliary heat sources, and how much thermal mass the driver has inside. Sleeping bags, extra clothing, Blankets. Experienced haul road drivers carry cold-rated sleeping bags as standard equipment. A sleeping bag rated to -20 or -30 provides meaningful insulation, but it is not a permanent solution in a cab that is trending toward -45. This is a situation where hours matter, and where a driver who remains calm, conserves body heat, and has prepared the right emergency kit has a dramatically different outcome than one who did not. The cargo complicates the picture further. The North Slope's supply chain depends on the continuity of these deliveries. Perishables, fuel, industrial fluids, and equipment that cannot be allowed to freeze represent cargo whose value can easily exceed the truck itself. A driver sitting on a dead truck in a remote section of the haul road is not just managing their own survival. They are managing the fate of a load that communities or oil field operations may be counting on. The responsibility that experienced haul road drivers carry is not abstract. It is the reason that pre-departure battery checks, oil viscosity decisions, and APU maintenance schedules are treated as safety priorities rather than maintenance afterthoughts. What comes out of these extreme situations? The ones that play out in the dark north of Atigun Pass when the temperature is dropping and the starter gives nothing, is a set of professional habits that define the most experienced drivers on this corridor. They check battery voltage before every run, not the casual glance that many drivers give to the readout. A deliberate check with a proper load tester that shows not just voltage, but actual capacity under load, which is the only measurement that reveals true battery health. A battery sitting at 12.6 volts with no load can still be a battery with badly degraded capacity that will fail under the cold start demand. Load testing shows the difference. They know the temperature forecast, not just for their departure point, but for the entire route over the course of their trip. The Dalton Highway corridor does not have uniform temperature. The Brooks Range creates its own weather. The coastal plain can be significantly colder than Coldfoot, or the wind can push conditions in directions that a Fairbanks forecast does not capture. Drivers who have run the road for years know the sections that collect cold air in winter inversions, know the passes where winds can drop the effective temperature well below ambient, and plan their stops accordingly. They also understand the relationship between rest stop location and battery vulnerability. Stopping the engine in the flat gravel plain north of the Brooks Range at peak cold, then restarting after a 10-hour rest, is a different proposition from stopping at Coldfoot and plugging into shore power for the night. The choice of where to rest is not just about hours of service compliance under FMCSA regulations. It is also a battery management decision. A driver with a marginal battery bank who chooses to rest in an unserviced location north of the pass, rather than pressing back to Coldfoot while the bank still has charge, is making a gamble. Experienced drivers on this run often say the same thing in different ways. The decision that keeps you safe is usually the one you make while everything is still working. There is something humbling about the relationship between a truck battery and the Arctic. The battery is one of the most commonplace components in any vehicle. Billions of them exist. They are the kind of thing that most drivers never think about until something goes wrong. But at -45 on the haul road, in a corridor where the nearest tow truck is hours away and the nearest cell tower is 100 miles south, the battery bank becomes the most critical single component on the rig. Everything else, the engine, the fuel system, the heating system, the navigation electronics, the electronic logging device, even the lights that warn other drivers of the truck's presence on the road, depends on it. The drivers who run this highway in winter think about their batteries the way pilots think about fuel. Not casually, not occasionally, with a kind of constant, respectful awareness that comes from understanding what failure means in an environment that does not forgive unpreparedness. They replace banks before they need to. They test before they leave. They choose rest stops with shore power when the margin is uncertain. They carry the emergency gear for the scenario they hope will never happen. Because on the Dalton in January, hope is not a maintenance strategy. The next time you watch a truck moving through cold weather, through a winter storm, through frost and ice and conditions that keep most vehicles parked, remember that the driver inside is not just managing the road. They are managing a system of interconnected vulnerabilities, any one of which in the wrong place at the wrong temperature can become a crisis. The battery is invisible. It is tucked in its box under the cab, doing its chemistry, delivering its current, hour after hour and mile after mile. But on the coldest roads in North America, that invisible chemistry is the difference between a truck that moves and a truck that doesn't. And on the Dalton Highway in February in the dark, that difference is everything. If extreme cold tests the limits of what a battery can endure, wait until you see what happens when the same drivers face the opposite extreme, navigating wildfire corridors in temperatures hot enough to soften asphalt, with smoke so thick that visibility disappears in an entirely different way, and cargo that cannot stop even when the world around it is burning. That story is next